everyone. Welcome to the latest Labour CND podcast. We hope that you've listened in to a couple of our other ones. We're new boys on the block, and we very much welcome a follow and a like if you do like and we want to follow. I'm going to tell you a bit about today's podcast and about our conversation with our guest, Sam Mason. And then we're going to go into the usual question and discussion. Sam is a vice chair of CND, and she's also the convener of CND's Trade Union Advisory Group. She's worked on the Alternative Defence Review, which is one of the topics we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to hand over for a moment to Sam to tell you a bit more about herself before I introduce the podcast. Sam, what do you want our listeners to know about your work?
Thanks, Carol, and thanks for inviting me along to participate in this podcast. Appreciate that. Yeah, just I think you've obviously said about my CND role and Trade Union Advisory Group and the Alternative Defence Review, but I've been a lifelong trade unionist and climate activist, environmental activist and anti-nuclear activist as well. And I guess I've just been fortunate as well. I was previously, as some people be aware, I was a policy officer at a trade union covering climate change and the impact on workers and just transition. We like to call it a transformative just transition, not just about doing a job swap, what's currently happening within the economy as well. So this neatly brings together, hopefully as we'll explore through some of the questions in the podcast, a lot of these angles as well. And I should probably just add, I'm not a person that has much of a leisure time, but my big leisure time activity is football. I'm a Charlton Athletic supporter, and it may surprise people, which it restores my faith in the ability of people to collectively come together when they understand injustice, because we've had huge campaigns at our football club against the ownership, and we've stood people for MPs. I won't go into the history of that, but yeah, politics never goes away from any environment or activity, but I do occasionally enjoy the football as well. But I'll probably just leave it there, as I could ramble on for too long about that. Thanks.
You're the second person we've interviewed who's talked about football. I'm impressed that you've got time for any form of relaxation or other activity, because I know you for many years have just been 24/7 on the issue of climate change. Anyway, let's move on to the sort of core of our topic today. I think many people who listen to this podcast and want to discuss these issues are likely to be asking themselves, what sort of messed up world are we living in? Military spending, the diversion of resources from welfare and other areas of government to the military, is an obvious example of this, but there are many more, and we're going to be talking about some of them. We've just this minute learned about another example, the agreement between Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron to set up a UK-France nuclear steering group, and I'm quoting from the government press release here, to coordinate policy, capability and operation. And what that means is that there's a coming together across Europe to develop Europe-wide nuclear cooperation. We're going to be looking at that in the future, I'm sure. Okay. These decisions about military spending, about nuclear cooperation, these decisions, like any other, are political decisions by the government. And like any political decision, they should be transparent. The argument for it should be submitted to scrutiny. But this is the one area of British government policy that has definitely not been subject to debate, and it should be. There is no excuse by claiming confidentiality no one is suggesting we should discuss the operational details of the Ministry of Defence. What we should be talking about, is it a sensible use of resources to move closer and closer to war preparation? And are there other things that we should be focusing on? And one of those other things that we're going to be focusing on today is the commentary in the Alternative Defence Review, which is produced by the RNT Union and CND. The commentary in that review about the impact of preparing for war on climate change issues. Now, just a quick plug for the CND podcast in passing. The last podcast we did, which you'll find on Spotify and all over the place, the last podcast we did was to talk about the Alternative Defence Review with a colleague of Sam's on that committee, and that was Alex Gordon. He was explaining that Keir Starmer's claims about increasing defence spending meant increased jobs was far from the truth. Today, we're going to turn to the impact of preparing for war on climate change. So my first question to you, Sam, is this. A strong theme in the Alternative Defence Review is that preparing for war undermines efforts to tackle climate change and declines in biodiversity, everything from deforestation to the degradation of coral reefs. I guess I want to ask you, what do you think are the main ways in which increasing and expanding military capability cuts across tackling climate change and biodiversity?
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I mean it's a huge topic to get into, and I think the very first thing, which is very marked, is the decline in debate and discussion about climate change. And I go back to, if we think around 2019 and obviously pre the pandemic setting in, where we were talking about climate emergencies and politicians were sort of bending over backwards to be meeting with the school student strikers around the climate situation, and that was the big discussion. Obviously, we then had the pandemic come and COVID-19, which of course put everything onto a back foot for obvious reasons. But it's the discussion on climate change has really dropped down the agenda. So although obviously within the Labour Party manifesto, making the UK a clean energy superpower was one of the missions, it's really been overtaken by this defence mission and growth, where now defence is at the centre of everything. And I think what we see on the very on one level, aside from the just general debate around it, is that we're seeing resources going away from the climate agenda. And this was already happening. We had the 28 billion for the Green New Deal that then got diminished down again. And whilst there are things happening around that agenda, it's absolutely clear now that everything is geared towards the defence strategy and military spending. So even energy transition now is discussed in those terms, because it's part of this whole society approach to supporting the defence agenda. And so it's on that level, but also, there's this kind of contradiction that somehow we can have both. We can have action on climate change and we can have this drive towards war, and which is the ultimate environmental destruction. And of course, if we put nuclear weapons into that mix, is the ultimate in climate change, because that would severely clearly alter climate on a incredible scale. And I think it's not often thought about. So there's the direct impacts which we see, we're seeing daily, the horrors of the destruction in Gaza. Obviously it's not just there, but that's what is there immediately on our screens day to day. So if you think about all that rubble, all the bombs, the munitions that have been dropped on there, there's massive environmental degradation gone on. So even, if we did have what we need, an end to that today, there's masses of work to be done. It leaves a scar. It also leaves a long legacy, which often doesn't get talked about in terms of the immediate impacts, because once the spotlight goes away, we've seen this in Iraq. We've seen, Iraq was a massively climate vulnerable country to start with, and obviously following the invasion in Iraq and all the war there and stuff that happened in Iraq, they've got scarce water resources. It's now incredibly climate fragile country. So it just destroys completely that environment of where that activity is. Well, I say activity makes it sound kind of like a benign thing, but where it's where bombs are dropping, the incredible military industrial complex, and I just think it also drives the military industrial complex, particularly in the US, drives the pursuit of fossil fuel resources, because particularly for the Americans, they are so reliant on oil for their global military activities. And you can see why all these things get so connected, about the support for the fossil fuel industries, the continuation, the business as usual, which is happening here to some extent as well, but obviously not on such a bigger scale somewhere like the US. But so I think it's all these ways, and it distracts us from what is the real, existential crisis that is actually facing humanity right now. And we're having this conversation in the middle of what I think is the third heat wave in the UK, well, in England anyway, this summer. And it's just astonishing that it just hasn't quite sunk into people's consciousness and the parallels between these things. And we've always said, the action on climate change requires peace. We have to have a peace agenda, not a war agenda, to take the steps that we need to be taking urgently. Perhaps I'll just leave it there.
Okay. And of course, climate change, scarce resources, and degradation of the environment is one of the key factors in the migration flows that we're seeing, isn't it? I take the point on what you're saying. One of the things that occurred to me following what's happening in the Middle East, following Ukraine and so on, is the way in which modern weaponry, drones, AI, etc., are being used not only in those wars, not only in those conflicts, but they've become a sort of a shop window for arms manufacturers selling their products. And the one thing that really worries people like me, who don't have anything like your depth of knowledge about the details of climate change, is the power and influence of the military, of the arms manufacturing companies, also, I think, cuts directly against the climate change argument, because those companies have every financial interest in driving to war, because that lines their shareholders' pockets. And is that right? Is that too crude? What do you reckon?
Well, no, I don't think that's too crude. I think fundamentally that's at the heart of it, because who has power, and this is one of the big issues we always have to tackle. Who has power and controls the agenda? Now, whether that's the fossil fuel corporations, the likes of BP and Shell, or whether in the military context, whether it's BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, and they do all control the agenda, and they have the ear of government and lobby, and it is profit driven. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I think we've had in terms of the climate change debates and energy transition is just because if there's not money to be made out of it, then fundamentally government doesn't want to pursue it, and these are political choices, and which is what we're seeing now, as far as I'm concerned, around government policy and energy transition, because it's not just that, okay, a couple of years ago we had no bidders for offshore wind contracts. The reason why companies didn't bid is because they weren't going to make money out of it. So we had a capital strike, and that's exactly what's happened. So they pushed the prices up because of the profit motive, and this is exactly what's happened around obviously the weaponry in terms of military and the changing nature of that weaponry as well. And I think what's really worrying, particularly when it's when you listen to the government speak, or you look at things like Strategic Defence Review, and it talks about innovation, it talks about this, although this sort of war scale need to manufacture and be ready. It's like, this is what we need to be doing on climate change. We could be doing these things. We could be manufacturing the things that we need. We could be bringing down the prices, or having, policy for people that ensures that every home gets retrofitted and can have a heat pump, or the proper insulation that it needs, and also obviously for keeping cool in summer, which we don't talk about so much. So it's almost it's quite bizarre that the language of government now is kind of what we were talking about 5 years ago on climate change, is what needed to happen. This kind of war drive, if you like, or war scenario to address the climate crisis, which has now been completely ignored. But we can do this to address the so-called war crisis. And it's a difficult path to see through, and I'm very concerned. I mean, the talk about AI and data centers, which need vast amounts of energy, huge amounts of energy. And I've no doubt that the AI strategy is linked into the nuclear strategy in terms of nuclear power. Because this is exactly what's happening in the US, and lots of countries now all looking to ramp up their nuclear power capacity, not to deal with decarbonisation. So although it's framed in clean energy and low carbon sources, actually it's to deal with all the big data questions, and which will be linked into AI and the AI strategies, which will all be linked into the warfare situation that we're confronting now, and which we have to really obviously fight back against. But it's important that we understand the links across these things.
Yeah, thanks. I do agree with that. But I think there's also another way in which the military impacts on climate change. There's what's begun is a discussion about what we're calling the military bootprint, which is probably a bit of a techie language. It's the impact of the technical side of war preparations, the impact of that on climate change. And that debate is just beginning to nudge its way into the climate debate. Can you give us some examples of what's meant by the military bootprint?
Yeah, no, it's I think the military bootprints is a really good term, and perhaps it may not resonate outside sort of climate nerds or whatever, but I mean, obviously, because we've always had your carbon footprint, and this is the kind of inverse of that. So it's like your military bootprint, but it's an anomaly first of all, it's a massive anomaly within the climate talk. So the COP, as we call them, Conference of Parties, the next one being in Brazil in November, which are the global climate talks organized through the UN system, that it's voluntary for countries to talk about their military emissions as part of their to get into techie language, but nationally determined contributions. It's about countries' overall contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So they governments don't have to report on them within that framework. And so we don't really have a very clear idea or discussion about what's going on in the military world around this. So there's two elements to it, I guess. So there's the the emissions in which obviously the military create in terms of its activities in the sense of, building the weapons, mass transfers, fighter jets around the world and all this kind of stuff and movements. And obviously their occupation, their bases and stuff like this. And then obviously there's the direct, which, slightly talked about a bit in the first question about the direct impact of the use of that technology. So it's, I think, it's really interesting now the, sorry, my brain's going fuzzy. So the bill that's just gone through the US, the big bill, what Trump's calling it, the super bill, which has got about, 1 trillion investment on military in there. And I think, some people in the US have done, very quick calculations that, just the addition of that is the equivalent of something like the greenhouse gas emissions of Ethiopia, which has got a sizable population. So, it's already estimated, and this is based on, I think, 2019 estimates by, organizations like Scientists for Global Responsibility. We calculated, that the military contributes around 5.5% to global greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions. That may not, people often think that doesn't sound very much. That is huge. And got to remember, everything that goes into the atmosphere stays there for centuries. It stays there for a long time. It's not about something we can just take out the air tomorrow. So this is significant as well, and it's these are sides of sort of middle income countries or whatever. So it's going completely the wrong direction. So now we've got this commitment to increase NATO spending to 5%. So that is massively going to increase greenhouse gas emissions, just from the production of all the hardware and everything else. So this just does not get talked about. It's almost like, and I just find it incredible contradiction that we're going to go, to Brazil in November, have the climate talks. There'll be difficult discussions there, as there always are at the climate talks, and somehow military will be on the side. But I think, you're right, as you said, this is coming more into the climate discussions. I don't think enough, but I think, there's fantastic organizations working globally around these kind of questions. There is a network called, I think, Climate Security, that is looking at this and trying to bring organizations together, mainly across Europe now, UK and the US. But I think they're very important in raising awareness around that, because we can't be blind to it and just have this sort of climate advocacy and trying to lobby without understanding the devastation of what all this means. And of course, as we always do around climate change, recognize that those that contribute the least, namely in the so-called global south, suffer the greatest consequences of climate change, and so they do tend to be on the end of obviously all these conflicts and military exhibition interventions and stuff as well. So and it's always the most vulnerable, poor, women, disabled, etc. So we've really got to start to link these things together and get the climate movement more on board with understanding this and the links between it. So I think it's been a really important development, and hopefully growing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were telling me just before this podcast started about the book you're reading on that very topic at the moment. I'm going to move on to the final question. In fact, it's two questions, or in two parts, if you like, because I'm going to ask not only that you sum up on the climate change issues that we've talked about, but I'm going to ask you to plug the Alternative Defence Review a bit, say more about it. Okay. First, what I'd like to hear from you is a look at the challenges that the climate movement faces. Some of them are, or many of them are implicit in what you've already said, but make them explicit what are the problems that people like yourself are facing when we get this sort of stuff across? And how do you think we should be responding to that?
Okay. Yeah, I think I think one of the biggest challenges we face in the climate movement, and this probably cuts across sort of more widely as well, but um, a lot has changed, and I think the old ways of doing things are, are just not going to cut through anymore. And I think the challenge will be is how we organise differently and mobilise differently, and sending off petitions, all of this stuff. It just it is fine, lobbying your MP, that's fine. I'm not saying we stop all the things, but I think there's a slightly different conversation going on now because and actually to bring in something which I've not really talked about in terms of trade unions, where we've also, as much as we have a struggle to win the debate, and obviously you spoke with Alex, as you said, Alex Gordon, around the jobs myth, around defence spending. This also means that we had that challenge from trade unions as well, because it used to be jobs versus climate. Now it's kind of jobs versus climate versus defence spending as well. Defence spending's always been there, but obviously not in the same way in which we're looking at now with the hikes that are being discussed, and also, of course, the massive investment in nuclear equally. So I I think we just, I hate using the word education, it just sounds slightly patronizing, but is to understand it's like why we've got all these fights and we have to continue with these fights. This is now part of a different challenge around the war narrative and the jobs narrative, and about how we should be situating this with obviously within a global sphere, particularly in solidarity fundamentally, with people in the global south and what they're fighting. But the wider issues that just cut across, and I think that's a huge challenge for us, because I don't think people like talking about war. They don't like talking politically sometimes in the climate movement. And we have to. And I think the best of organisations do that. We were doing that through the Climate Justice Coalition, which I'm not so involved with these days, but that was very much part of it as well. And organisations like War and Want as well have been very good at making these links across, because I think one thing which people do realise, and Naomi Klein has spoken on some of this stuff, if we look at stuff around, sort of the iron domes and these concepts, you've mentioned about climate change forces migration, which it does, and environmental degradation. Absolutely, populations have to move for varieties of reasons, which is driven by climate change and environmental degradation and war. But as we've seen, this sort of militarization of borders, not just recently, obviously it's been going on for some time, is that governments are aware of all these things. They're not ignorant to them. And this is why, like with the US, they've always seen climate change is one of the biggest threats and threats multipliers. They've always talked about it. So I was always confident the US military was never going to let it go off the agenda, because they understand the impacts of climate change on their operations. So I think it's just trying to ramp up and get far more political and kind of coherent discussions around the arguments, and linking that together, and particularly with the nuclear agenda as well, because just coming a bit more specifically to nuclear weapons and nuclear power. I mean, the government has stated explicitly now that we're a nuclear nation. The links between civil and defence nuclear is no longer being fudged or hidden. It's clearly stated in documents, and we still have a fight within the climate environmental movement around the case for nuclear power. I think, if anything, should be telling any climate activists why we don't need nuclear power for a whole variety of reasons, but this whole link to the military agenda is certainly, a big one as well. I must admit, I've probably rambled on a bit and forgot sorry, parts of your question. But
it is in two parts. So just finish what you're saying, which is what about the challenges that the climate change movement faces, and then I'll ask you as a final question, a final part about the Alternative Defence Review. You can give it a plug. So carry on and finish what you're saying.
Okay, yeah, just briefly, yeah. So I suppose the other challenge as well, I mean, is within this sort of welfare, not warfare framing, because it's and I had this, certainly working in a union about, what should be the priorities. Bread and butter issues like pay, pensions, terms, conditions. Well, of course, as a trade unionist, they're always the core issues, but the point is that all these things are interlinked. So, and we have had a struggle around this when you've got things like the cost of living crisis and the acuteness of that, and obviously still, and going to continue to massively impact people. So how do you link in? And again, I've talked more about the sort of warfare aspect, but there's also the welfare aspect in climate change, and getting across that actually the solutions, and certainly not investing in increased military spending and militarization, but the solutions to these are also the solutions that we need to address cost of living issues and much more social and economic justice issues that have always been there. And personally, I've always said, climate change is an issue of political, economic, environmental, and social justice, and those things should be part of all of it. So it's not just about the big technological solutions, many of which are being advocated by this government, which I disagree with, like carbon capture and storage, for example. But a lot. This is about political economy and political will, and I think that's where climate activists have to step up as well and start understanding that better. So I'll finish there. Thanks.
I think that sort of takes us neatly back to where we started. About the fact that the government doesn't discuss these issues, doesn't name them for what they are, which is rearmament, a drive to war, and not some of the more technical terms that are used like militarism and militarization and so on. And I completely agree with you that the solutions require that we do a lot of work in the labour movements, the trade unions, around this issue. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, if I can just add a wee comment of my own, one of the things that strikes me is the GMB, which is the most gung-ho for military spending and claims that it's secure, well-paid technical jobs and so on. The GMB has a tiny membership in the military industry. It's much more of a general union. And you can probably, I don't have the figures to hand, but you can probably make the same case, for instance, with Unite, which has gone much more towards towards those arguments in the last few years. Anyway, the final thing is we keep talking about the Alternative Defence Review. I think it's obvious to people who are listening that you and I and others are seeing this as a sort of alternative framing of the debate than that which the Strategic Defence Review attempts to frame the discussion. So in the last minute or two, can you just tell us very briefly what is the Alternative Defence Review and why you think it might make or does make an important contribution to the debate?
Yeah, I mean, primarily, obviously, the Alternative Defence Review, we got together as a working group to develop this when there was news about the government working on its own strategic defence review. And I think there's not many surprises coming out of the SDR, to use the acronym, in the sense of the direction of travel and increase in military spending and stuff like that. But and its whole pre-war narrative. I mean, some of this is prefigured in Tory documents as well. By the way, I think we need to remember it's not just Labour coming in. This has been even Grant Shapps, I remember saying that, we're in a pre-war situation. So this has been building for some time. But I think, particularly what we were interested in. Oops, sorry, just had a phone call to stop. So I think particularly what we were interested in, because the one thing we knew is that, the unions have supported the defence agenda. And again, going back to sort of 2022 when TEC Congress overturned a motion on defence diversification, that they very much see this as jobs, and it literally is more or less jobs for the boys, to be frank, because despite that there's always nice glossy pictures of young women apprenticeships or whatever, it's mainly male jobs, and what they call high skilled. So I think it was an attempt to help build the confidence and arguments that we should be focusing on what are the real priorities for people, for real, we call it human and common security. And and that is, as I said at the beginning, the existential threat of the climate crisis and environmental degradation. I mean, but when we talk about climate change, it's important to note that what we're also saying within that is around biodiversity loss, and all those other things that go with it. It's not a singular thing, but increased poverty, and inequality and stuff like this. And these are the things we should be prioritizing, and that should be part of the national debate. But we suddenly sort of land at this place, and it's bizarre in that they say with the strategic defence review they wanted to be part of a national discussion about a whole economy approach, whatever they call it, and yet we have no discussion about it. We're just being sold that actually we're heading to war and we need to get ready for it, and it's quite distressing. And they talk about resilience, but even now with climate change, so the whole, I don't like to frame it in net zero because there's specifics around the language of net zero, but the point is that has now diminished, but it's not gone into a sort of climate denial. It's gone into a kind of climate acceptance that, okay, this is happening and now we just have to kind of get on with it, and push ahead. And I think so in a way the alternative review is trying to certainly push back about that, user in trade unions and the wider labour movement to have these discussions, and very sharp discussions and frank discussions, because we need that, and it can't just be boiled down to these kind of platform grand statements about jobs. It's humanity is more than that. And our common humanity is. So it's, and we've always said, whether it's jobs in fossil fuels, I'm not blaming people who work in those sectors right now. And that's the whole point. It's about how do we set up that transition plan, whether it's defence diversification, whether it's just transition, to make sure workers and communities are protected through these processes. And that's the absolutely crucial point. And they can be. And this is, as I said before, this is political choices, and it's always political choices. And, we need to open up this debate more widely, and hopefully we will do that through the ADR.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks very much indeed. And a particular thanks, as we've both been struggling through this podcast in 31, 32-degree temperature. So particularly pleased that you were willing to join us in this desperate heat. There will be other opportunities to discuss these topics and related topics in Labour CND podcasts. We hope that all our listeners and viewers will join us in that. If you've enjoyed this, if it sparks some interest or some aspect of the situation you've not thought of before, please go to the Labour CND website. Please go to the CND website and pick up some more detail about the things that we've been talking about. Sam Mason, member of the Alternative Defence Review and a CND Vice Chair, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope we'll speak to you later.